All right, let's dive right in to one of the most polarizing figures in modern history, Ferdinand Marcos of the Philippines. Depending on who you ask, he was either a nation builder, a true savior, or he was a tyrant who plundered his own country. So how can one person's legacy be so incredibly divided? That's the complex story we're going to get into today. And we have to start with the man's own words, right? This was his claim, his story. I saved the Republic. I mean, that is a powerful, clear-cut statement. It frames him as the hero, the one leader who had to make the tough calls to pull his nation back from the brink of chaos. Okay, but that's his side of the story, and this really gets us to the heart of what we're talking about today. How does that bold claim actually hold up when you look at the historical record? This right here is where things get really, really complicated. To even begin to understand the Marcos legacy, you have to start with the single biggest, most defining moment of his presidency, his declaration of martial law back in 1972. So what even is martial law? Well, in theory, it's supposed to be a temporary emergency measure. It's when a government basically says, okay, we're pausing normal laws and putting the military in charge of civilian life. It's a tool that's really only meant for the most extreme situations. And for the Filipino people, this wasn't some abstract concept. This was their new reality. Martial law under Marcos meant your basic civil liberties were just gone. The military was suddenly in control of society. The free press was silenced, and thousands could be arrested without a warrant, without any due process. So as you can imagine, this era of military rule completely reshaped the Philippines, and it really set up the pillars of what we now call the Marcos legacy. Let's see how this spiraled into a much bigger story about power. And here is the absolute crucial point. What was supposedly a temporary measure to save the Republic, well, it didn't stay temporary. Not at all. Martial law dragged on for almost a decade, and in that time, it cemented Marcos's grip on power. The government was transformed into a full-blown dictatorship, with one man holding absolute authority over everything. And you know what often comes with that kind of absolute, unchecked power? Widespread allegations of massive corruption. And we're not talking about small amounts of money here. We're talking about historical accounts and court records that point to billions of dollars allegedly plundered from the country's treasury, all funneled away through a huge network of cronies. And this leads us to the third and honestly the most tragic piece of his legacy. The historical record is just filled with these extensive reports of human rights abuses. We're talking thousands of political opponents, activists, journalists. Anyone who dared to speak out were reportedly subjected to torture, imprisonment, and in far too many cases, extrajudicial killings. That means they were killed by state forces without any kind of trial or legal process. So, you see what's happening here? We have two completely different stories. On one side, you have the savior of the Republic. On the other, a brutal dictator. And this brings us right to the enduring contradiction at the very core of the Marcos legacy. And this just lays it out so clearly. Look at these two columns, right next to each other. In one, you've got the self-proclaimed hero, the man whose supporters will point to new bridges and buildings. And in the other column, you have a historical record that details a dictatorship, mind-boggling corruption, and horrific human rights violations. The two just don't seem to line up. And that conflict right there is exactly why, decades later, the Marcos name is still one of the most charged, most polarizing topics you can bring up in the Philippines. It's a debate that's not just about one man anymore. It's about history, it's about memory, and it's about how an entire nation chooses to define itself. Which, at the end of the day, leaves us all with a pretty profound question. How do we truly measure a leader's legacy? Is it based on their own words? Is it the concrete and steel they build? Or is it measured by the freedoms that were lost and the lives that were destroyed along the way? That's a question every generation really has to grapple with for itself.